global wildlife initiative focused on providing a broad suite of services to stakeholders in the international conservation community. Shane serves as the Vice Chair of the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, International Liaison for the Wildlife Society, and North American Expert of the International Council for Game and Wildlife Conservation. So with that, let's welcome Shane Mahoney here.
Thank you, Nathan, very much. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for the invitation. And I tell you, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've been involved in this effort of conservation for a long time. And one of the things that I've come to recognize is that it has no possibility of success without individuals, and it has no possibility of success without individuals who are willing to work together for the greater good. I often liken conservation to the issue of nation building, and have to admit that it was the writings and speeches of Theodore Roosevelt that got me thinking along these lines. The truth of the matter is that conservation can only be built by the selfless actions of people who care about something bigger than themselves. And that is exactly the same as a nation. You cannot build it otherwise. So here we are, 50 years after you were formed. 50 years. That's half a century. It's a long period of time. A lot of people have changed. I don't guess most of you were part of the first group. So between then and now, there have been waves of people who have come forward to do the same kinds of things that you have done. And we finally stand here 50 years later, and we have to ask ourselves, over this long and proud era of service, where we come from and where we are headed, and what are we fighting for? They may seem simple questions, but in today's world, most of us find that we have very little time to ask the most important questions, chasing answers all the time, often without asking questions at all, it seems to me. Most of you are aware of the history of conservation on this continent, but I would say there's none of us so well versed in this room that we can't learn more. The story of what we have achieved in Canada and the United States for the conservation of wildlife is now legendary around the world. It is not an accident that we have the abundance of wildlife we have today. We got some lucky breaks, but overall it was because of the applications we made, the ideas we fought for, the policies we established, the legislation we created, the organizations we built. I try to remind people, as we face the challenges we do today, that it helps a great deal to go back and examine what others faced 50 and 100 and even 150 years ago. It is difficult for many people, whether they are 75 or 25, it is difficult for many people to grasp the fact that if your country had had an Endangered Species Act in 1887 or 1900 or 1910 or 1920, that white-tailed deer, elk, black bear, wild turkey, Canada geese, wood duck, beavers, pronghorn. Every one of those species would have been on it. Schools were closed in the northeastern U.S. so that children in the early part of the 20th century could see the track of a deer. We had a circumstance where anybody with eyes to see could understand that wildlife was disappearing at a pace that if something was not done, it would simply disappear. Most people don't know that when the Boone and Crockett Club established its first display of heads and horns to show the American people these animals, it was not because they wanted to extol the virtues of themselves as hunters or prove how capable and manly they were. It was because they thought that the citizens of the United States of America would never see these animals, that there was no hope. The title was, Come See the Vanishing Wild Species of America. The subtext was, Before it's too late. Now, 99.99% of your citizens don't know that. So it's hard for them to imagine when they see skeins of geese, turkey in their driveways, white-tailed deer in their tulips or roses. It's a little difficult for them to even conceive of such a time. But such a time was the time of a group of people just like you. That is why I call what happened in the early part of the 20th century a revolution. The decision by this country, and this country led this movement in North America and really was ahead of almost all the rest of the world in doing so. This revolution was to suddenly decide that we would not lose wildlife and that we would make it a fundamental priority of your nation to ensure that the wild others we share this continent with would not disappear. That was completely radical thinking. And why do I say that? Well, I want you to think about obstacles, because I know, and I speak primarily at this point in this part of the address to the younger people in this room. You're going to hear a lot about the obstacles we face and the challenges that we have. And I'll bet you that there are going to be times when you wonder if it's possible for us to overcome them. So I'm going to give you a list of challenges that you can't even imagine as you start out on your careers. Challenges that were met, broken into small pieces, and eaten by the passion of the people who simply would not let wildlife disappear. So I want you to imagine obstacles like these. There are no state or federal agencies working for wildlife. None. Pretty much anywhere. There are no funding mechanisms whatsoever. They don't exist to do anything for wildlife. To save an individual animal, to transport something from here to there, to safeguard it from illegal killing by anyone and everyone. There were no university programs. None. There was no place for people to go and study, as the young students here are studying. Not because you couldn't afford it or your parents weren't this or that, but simply because there was no place to go. There were no programs to take. They did not exist. And there was no legislation to speak of. And what there was ridiculous, because there was no enforcement for it anyway. So you could say you should protect waterfowl or deer or something of this nature, but it didn't make any difference because there was no one there to do it. So there was no really effective legislation of any kind, and certainly no federal legislation of any kind. There was no awareness of conservation whatsoever. Now just imagine that that's your day at work. And your job, what you are going to commit your life to, is to protect wildlife and conserve it. Where do you turn? But it was a lot worse than that. A lot worse. Because at the same time, in this country as in Canada, there was a complete and utter belief and acceptance of the notion of man's dominion. A deep, deep religious belief that there should be no checks upon man's dominion over nature. That was the literal interpretation of late 19th, early 20th century America and Canada. There was also a firm belief in this country of total inexhaustibility. No one believed there was any limits. You have to remember that at that time, there was only a sprinkling of people, Europeans, west of the Mississippi. This continent was still just a big, wide open wilderness place. I mean, to suggest that there was any limit on what could be taken was ridiculous. So, you imagine going into work, going into the public and trying to explain that we have a problem. And on top of that, this, the most capitalistic nation in the world, was suddenly feeling its strength. You had begun now the ascent to become the most powerful nation in the world. That's when it started. And you were making your way towards influence and power by demonstrating, perhaps better than any other nation ever has, the capacity to do well. But that meant that the individual had to be unfettered. So your other big problem was the very notion of standing in the way of people making money off wildlife was perceived as perverse and anti-American. The giant families, the biggest corporations, the most influential backdoor people in your country were making fortunes from the death of wildlife. And your job, with all of those obstacles, is to tell your society, your communities, your friends, your families, your political leaders, that all of that has to change. So, as some colleagues who know me from many years will attest, that's why I don't really get hung up on problems too much. I'm far more concerned with solutions. We don't have any problems today, ladies and gentlemen. Not compared with that. I don't think. Now, we do have a few new ones that they didn't have, but they still don't match obstacles that were in their way. You have university programs. You have laws and legislation. You have funding mechanisms. You have state and federal agencies. You have university programs. You have academics. You have all these kinds of things at our disposal today that they did not have. And that they took wildlife from the worst of possible circumstances and set it on a path forward that's responsible for those geese I hear every hour of the day that I am in my room in this hotel. When I see people describe them as flying carp on license plates, I get a little touchy. Now I want you to think of what they achieved. The recovery of wildlife and the abundance of wildlife in this country and Canada is, as I said, legendary around the world. We have created a nexus, and particularly you in the United States of America have created a nexus of conservation organizations that's almost unbelievable. If you travel to Europe tomorrow, you will not find Ducks Unlimited. If you travel to Europe tomorrow, you will not find the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. If you travel to Europe tomorrow, you will not find Pheasants and Quail Forever, or the Nature Conservancy, or the Isaac Walton League, or the Audubon Society, or the tens of thousands of lesser-known entities that exist in your country, all working for wildlife, all finding niche space and money to do some good. You have world-class university programs that lead the world, incredible funding mechanisms that nobody else in the world has, including Canada, such as Pittman Robertson, Dingle Johnson, Wallop-Rowe, and so on. You have a diversity of protected areas in your country that is unmatched anywhere in the world. You have, as we all know, a bewildering array of rules and legislation and restrictions and guidances that everybody who interacts with nature must abide by. You have highly effective enforcement operations. And you have maintained, in a society that has changed absolutely fundamentally over the last 100 years, you have maintained hunting and angling in your communities to an extent that is absolutely phenomenal. We take that for granted, don't we? But how did it happen? How did all this happen? Is all of this some kind of beautiful accident? No. It's not a beautiful accident. It's a beautiful example of what people just like you can do if they decide to live their lives for something that will outlast it. Which in my world is the only purpose to this life any of us have. There is no other purpose as far as I'm concerned. And why does all this matter? It all matters because conservation matters. And this world in this century, believe you me, when we reach 7.5 to 8 billion and scream our way upwards from there to 8.5 to 9, there will not be a human being that sucks oxygen in this planet that will not know why conservation is so important. It may have been the far-sighted who began this process over a century ago now, but I can tell you that could they be still living, they would see witness in this century of the prophecies they've made and the things they safeguarded all of us from. Conservation matters more than anything else in the world if what we are talking about is having healthy, peaceful human existence. There is nothing that comes even close. Economically, spiritually, socially, for citizens, for communities, for nations. Where would we be without it? What kind of world would we have? What kind of life would you have? Would your children have? What hope would there be? You know, the funny thing is, we often wish more people cared, but somehow I sense that deep down most people understand all of this. They may not be involved as we are, but deep down they understand that clean water matters and clean air matters and that healthy food matters. But ultimately what we have to try and create is a mechanism where society will act upon those ideas that these things matter, isn't it? I mean, that's really what we want. It's not enough for you to do what you do. You have to infect others. You have to be viral. You have to convince others who will never go down this road, who will never study and train to become professionals in this business, that they too must become part of this. And I hope there are some in this audience who are saying, well, that's all nice to say, but that's impossible to do. So let me ask you this question. If Theodore Roosevelt did not manage to reach a vast majority of American citizens somehow without a cell phone, why is it that no president, no administration, since he left office, has ever fundamentally changed the policies of conservation that he instilled and started in this country? When he brought his policies in, they were despised by the political elites in Washington. Yet not a single president since has dared to fundamentally change them. Why didn't Taft do it right away? He couldn't stand Roosevelt. Why didn't he just rescind all those wildlife reserves and national forests and all that kind of foolishness? It's one of the biggest questions in conservation history, and it remains unanswered. I think it was because he reached the citizens of the United States and convinced them that even though they may not be activists, that to call yourself a citizen of the United States of America meant that you had to care at some level for the conservation of the natural world. And that the squandering of the natural resources of this nation was anti-American. In no field will everybody wear on their arm a band that says, I am a crusader for this. But many people in society are not crusaders either for education. They don't wear a band. They may not be crusaders for equality of rights. They may not be crusaders for good health care. There may be all kinds of things they're not crusaders for, but that does not mean that they do not care. If they were all crusaders, you would be out of a job. And of course, we remember the great ones, don't we? We talk about the Roosevelts and the Grinnells and the Pinchots and the Hornadays and the Darlings and the Leopolds and all of that, you know. But if they were all up here on this stage, they would all tell you the same thing. They would all tell you that it was the countless individuals who worked with them that made it happen. Teddy Roosevelt was president for a short period of time, and he threw his weight around, thankfully, in the right directions. But he was only there a short period of time. I used to work in government. I worked in government for a long period of time. It was a good profession. I spent most of the first 2/3 of my career living with wild animals and getting paid for it, so I thought I had pretty well fooled everyone. It was excellent, actually. I was a real con artist for most of my career. It was superb. But I've come to realize, and I came to realize long before I left government, that government is not the game that's going to win conservation. There's a tendency on our part, almost everywhere, to look to government to do good things for conservation, and sometimes we get good policies and legislations out of government. That is true. Sometimes I wonder if it's not all an accident when that happens, but nevertheless, it does happen. But the future of conservation does not lie with government. Oh yes, we need strong state agencies and federal agencies. I agree with that, of course. But we all know that those bureaucracies will be turned in certain ways depending on certain pressures. So what ultimately we require is the most pressure in the best directions for the conservation of nature. And to create that pressure, We need individual citizens en masse to believe in what we say and to join us in what we do. It is an astounding thing that all of you have encountered, or if you're very new in the game, like some of the people I met from Pheasants yesterday evening. One individual was there 3 days and another had his job for 2 weeks, so I call them new. But if you have been in for any significant period of time, you will come to notice how a lot of people talk about conservation as though it's fairly simple. Well, you should do that. Oh, yeah, you should do that. Oh, that makes perfect sense. You should just go, you should just do this. They would never go to a nuclear fission laboratory, walk in off the street and say, you should do that. You should do this. No, you should do that. I just feel you should do that. Split the atom that way. And, let's see what happens. They would never dream of doing that to someone in the medical profession. They would never dream of doing it to somebody who's an architect. But every one of you have had this experience with people coming in and saying, why are you so silly or lazy or stupid, or what does it take you so long to do things when it's so clear what needs to be done? This has always amazed me, because I've always considered ultimately this problem to be our failing. Somehow we have failed to communicate to the wider world that conservation is a profession and an undertaking in life that involves everything from the economy to social norms and behaviors to biological characteristics of natural systems to the completely unpredictable events that can happen in this planet of ours in terms of weather and tidal change and things of that nature. Everything impinges on conservation, and yet somehow people think it's simple. It's extraordinary. We could have 50 years of strong research indicating that we should do things in a certain way and let commodity prices soar. What happens to all that science? Let the world economy change, let the dependence on oil and energy become a major priority for a government or a nation, and look at the implications for the conservation of nature. And yet who has to figure all this out and arbitrate all of this? You. All you young people who are going into this business, don't be afraid from this lecture. That's not the purpose. But you are undertaking one of the most complex things in the world. It's also one of the most beautiful things. It is worth giving 2 lives to, if you had them. I have had experiences in the natural world that are priceless. I have seen things and participated in the lives of wild creatures at a level that most people have not. And I did it for a very long period of time. And every time I would see one of these spectacles, it would cause me to reflect on how it came to be. Because you can travel to many places on this planet and you would never have the opportunity to have these experiences. Yet we have them. We have them because people before us fought the fight that we are fighting. We have them because people frustrated out of their minds by people who wouldn't listen, or the incapacity of politicians to agree or to do the right thing in their opinion. We have people who gave their lives from the age of 20 to the age of 60 or 65, which is essentially their lives, to this. And we ought to honor them by at least remembering that. I was in Tampa, Florida for meetings a few weeks ago, or 10 days ago, stayed with a man who has a home next to a golf course. I've never played golf ever in my life. But anyway, he wanted me to get in this little contraption, this cart, and tumble around on this golf course while he got out and practiced his game. So we were talking conservation, except it was kind of like a stutter, you know. You'd start the conversation, then he'd stop the little cart, and he'd get out and he'd hit a few balls, he'd get back in, and we'd start the conversation again. It was one of the weirdest conversations on conservation I've ever had in my life. I mean, this is all true, unfortunately. But the really interesting thing was, there was one spoonbill and several cranes on the golf course, which allowed me to forget about everything else and look at those birds, which was excellent. But just imagine, one time people would have paid fortunes to have seen one. And now they're strutting around, as cranes do, you know, on the golf course. Don't ever take it for granted, because it can be all taken. We stand in the way, collectively, you and I, of a world that is far less than any of us would want to give our children. We stand collectively for a world where it is always going to be possible for people to see extraordinary things in nature. The birth of young animals, the return of migrating butterflies, the battles of great stags, the power and potential savagery of the great carnivores. We stand for a world where mountains have wild sheep, where alpine meadows have elk. We stand for a world where there are streams where living creatures flash through the shallows and we get to see them. We live for a world where birds sing. The greatest of artists in the history of mankind, the greatest of scientists in the history of mankind, none of them could give us that. Only we can give us that. It will be, for all of you, as it has been for me and colleagues, it will be a never-ending fight. I think the word conservation was developed to explain what we mean by hope springs eternal. The reason hope springs eternal, I assume, is because it's never satisfied. What we hope for never really comes true. Well, conservation is like that. The fight will never end. There will never be a day when a group of people like you sit in a room and say, we are here on our 75th to celebrate the end of all challenges to the conservation of wildlife. That is never going to happen. And you are never going to have a career where you are unfrustrated, unless you don't care. So you will be frustrated. You're going to have a career that will have great successes, and you will have a career that will have failures. But you will also have a career that gives you a sense of purpose, a sense of worth. And by and large, you know, almost every citizen in your nation, when you tell them you work for wildlife or you work for wild creatures, they say, yeah, that's a good thing. You know what? That's a good thing. They don't have an armband on saying that's a good thing, but you open the dialogue, and they'll say that's a good thing. Because it is a good thing. It's the best thing. We have 7.5 billion of us on this one blue planet. As far as we know, good planets are really hard to find. So we can pretty much expect this is it. And what we do in every phase of society, every period of time, matters tremendously to what we can do in the next. Because those a century ago thought as they thought, because they won as they did win, we now have options to decide what to do with the wildlife and lands we still have. Is more being lost as I speak here this evening? Yes. Is more being won at the same time as I sit here this evening? Yes. Did we not face the issue of DDT? Have we not helped recover raptors? Will we not be able to mirror that success with the pollinators and the insecticides that have wreaked havoc upon them? Do we not understand that the blueprints that have been developed before are ones that we can use, that we can take forward? I started my career working in parasitology. And that was a fascinating field because it gave me a new appreciation for roundworms especially. Because part of my research at that time was to examine the helminth fauna, the parasite load, if you will, of various species of waterfowl. And one of the most amazing things, I was probably 19 or 20 years of age at that time. I raced through many years of university very quickly for some reason. I look back on it now and I can't imagine why, but anyway, I did it. Anyway, I was quite young when I was looking at these things. So I'd take these birds that had been dead for 2 years and I'd take them out of deep freezes and I'd let them thaw out and I'd eviscerate them. I'd take out all the various organs, I'd mash them up, chomp them up, squeeze them through so we'd get all the goodies out of the intestines and all these kinds of things, and then I'd lay them out in the petri dishes by organ, and then I'd use a stereoscope, to pick through them and see what kind of goodies I would find here that were living within the innards of these waterfowl, these ducks. And unbelievably, many times there were living roundworms in those petri dishes, frozen solid for 2 years. There's absolutely no point to that story if you're looking for it. I mean, I'm serious. It popped into my head and there's no point to it. But you won't forget it. When you next eat something that could be infected with roundworms, you'll probably, and people say, oh, don't worry, it was frozen. Yeah, well, I know Shane Mahoney, and believe me, it was quite amazing. I was enthralled to see these things wiggling and squirming after being frozen solid for 2 years. But it does lead me to another story, and I really didn't mean to tell that story, but anyway, you're very gracious to accept it. That's what happens when you don't have a prepared text. But I moved from parasitology to working on seabirds. Most people know me for my large mammal research, but actually I was heavily involved in seabird research for a period of time. And that was really kind of my first adult immersion in completely unspoiled environments with no one else but myself and no one else to rely on but myself, because I studied them on offshore islands off the coast of Newfoundland where lots can go wrong, and plenty of stuff often did. I worked on a bird called a murre, which is a alcid, which is one of the Alcidae family, black and white seabirds that live in the Atlantic. And we have many of them in the northwest Atlantic, and Newfoundland has famous seabird colonies. So we had a lot of these murres. They're about that high. They're a black bird with a white belly and some small white, a patch of white on their wings. They have a long, narrow bill, and they're kind of penguin-like in their movements. They pursue fish underwater, so the wings are foreshortened to give them good flying skills, but superb diving and swimming skills underwater. They're an interesting bird for many reasons. The Migratory Bird and Convention Act, brought in 1916, became highly relevant, not to those birds, but those birds were highly relevant to it, because when Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, we were an independent country until 1949, Newfoundland is where I come from, we hunted these seabirds to a very appreciable extent. And Canada, which was signature to the Migratory Bird and Convention Act, told us that if we joined Canada, we had to give up this hunt. Newfoundlanders are the only people in Canada and the United States who can hunt those birds. We're still hunting and eating them. They're delicious. That's not my story. My story is this. Those birds have given up all nest building. They lay their egg on bare rock, shelves of rock that are this wide, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 feet above the sea. The egg is wide in the base and very narrow at the tip, so when it is hit, it spins. It doesn't roll. And that's how they prevent it from all running off the cliff edge. The chicks hatch after 21 days, these gorgeous little black and white puffballs with a little tiny little black beak sticking out. And the parents take turns bringing back fish to them. And they do this by carrying the fish back whole in their throats, feeding it to the chick whole. The chick eats the whole little fish and sits there with the fish sticking out of its mouth and slowly digesting it in just heavenly glory while he's just slowly digesting this fish into his gullet. It's a beautiful thing to see. After about 4 weeks, these little birds are about that high. They can't fly at all. They have great big feet, which makes sense. Little tiny little wings, which makes sense because they live on a piece of rock about that wide. Because these are colonial nesting seabirds. There's tens of thousands of them, all mingled in a complete and utter chaos. And if you don't like ticks, do not go on those ledges. I have had hundreds crawling on me at one time. It's amazing. As soon as the sun hits the ledges, the ticks explode. It's really something to see. Anyway, that's not my story either. So, these little chicks, after about 3 to 4 weeks, they're sitting on that ledge. They've never been off it. And suddenly around mid-July, the evenings become warmer, and something happens on those colonies. Now, I've been there since Paddy's Day, around March 17th, because Newfoundlanders always say the turs, as we call them, come back to land on Paddy's Day. So I would go out on Paddy's Day and I would stay there right on through August. In July, the evenings, suddenly great agitation would come on the ledges just before dark. Fights would break out. These birds growl, just like a mammal does. And there'd be constant fighting and breaking over the chicks and so on and so forth. And then some of the adults would fly down to the bottom of the cliffs, and then they would swim back and forth under the ledges, screaming and throwing open their mouths. And as they throw open their mouths, the inside of their mouths is a bright yellowish orange. And you can see them all the way down there, even in the dusk. You can see this flashing of mouths underneath. And all of a sudden, these little chicks, they waddle to the edge and they look down. They move back again and they crouch down, and the parents still calling them down below. And eventually, of all the violent, thunderous, powerful things I have seen in nature, this stands as equal to any of them. These little chicks that have known nothing but this tiny piece of ledge suddenly leap. You leap with them. These were chicks I had weighed and measured as when they were in the eggs, and then they hatched, and then suddenly they start to simply jump off this cliff. And they hold out those big black feet and those little tiny wings, and they beat them as fast as they can till they finally hit the rocks or the water. The waves come in and throw them up against the cliff face, and then they bounce out, pop up like little corks, and then they swim to sea with one parent bird. There will be many times in your career, if you fight hard for what you believe in, where you will wonder whether it is worth fighting more. And in the end, your decision to carry on will be a leap of faith as much as anything else. I have thought of those little birds who I have not seen do that jump for almost 30 years. I think about them all the time. Because courage is good, commitment is good, perseverance is good. But in the end, in fighting for the world of nature, it is so complex and there are so many challenges that ultimately we are all called upon repeatedly to make leaps of faith. No need to remember me, but remember those little birds on the islands off the coast of Newfoundland when you face those times. I thank you sincerely for what you do, because I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if you didn't do what you do, this world would be a far, far poorer place. Thank you very much. It is you who deserve this. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Stick around for possible questions.
Oh, yes, of course.
Thank you for that excellent address, Shane, on conservation matters. Really resonated with myself, and I'm sure a lot of our members. We do have a little bit of time. Does anybody have any questions for Shane while he's up here? If not, I think you'll be around for a little while.
I certainly will. Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you.